Anglo-American environmentalism, because so as we already said, like it leads to this blaming of humanity, right? This kind of misanthropic view, which is not going to help you solve the problem, and it leads to the idea that humans need to be removed from nature in order for nature to thrive, and this is also historically wrong. Because all of these landscapes that are beloved by environmentalists, whether it's like the Great Plains or the forests of the West Coast or the Amazon, right? The Amazon rainforest. These are all what you could call cultural landscapes. They're all co-creations of indigenous civilization and nature. So you can't. The Amazon. The latest research is that the Amazon has been inhabited for longer than it was the Amazon as we know it. So that tells us that the Amazon evolved with the indigenous populations that live there.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. Aside from some corners of the right-wing media sphere, it's widely accepted that humans are driving climate change, and thus environmentalism has become mainstream. But what if humanity isn't to blame? What if this general faulting of humanity, the idea that humans are inherently bad for nature, is meant to paper over or rather ignore the foundational roots of this planetary destruction, at a time when it's more crucial than ever that we acknowledge the true causes of climate change? What if the real culprit is the systems we're forced to operate under, where humanity doesn't really have a say? Systems like capitalism, imperialism, colonialism. And until we address these destructive structures in which US empire is in the driver's seat, we can't actually tackle the climate crisis that's killing the Earth. So who or what is to blame? What are the limitations of the mainstream environmental movement? What's the actual solution? And where do indigenous communities and decolonization fit in? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Justin Podur, a professor at York University in Toronto, author of many books including Extraordinary Threat, Haiti's New Dictatorship, America's Wars on Democracy in Rwanda and the DR Congo, and Siegebreakers, and host of the Anti-Empire Project podcast. But before we jump into it, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can help it grow by becoming a patron at patreon.com/breakthroughnews, or you can donate below on YouTube. Justin, welcome back to the show.
Oh, thank you, Rania. It's the highlight of my week to be on your show.
Oh my gosh, that sounds so lovely. And now I feel really, really special. It's the highlight of my week to have you on. Now every other guest I have on is going to get very upset that I said that, but it's going to be okay.
But I guess you don't have that many guests in 1 week, I guess. So.
I mean, a couple usually, It depends. Every week it differs. It depends. I try to keep up, I try to constantly have new guests on. So, and now I apologize to any of those who are watching who feel offended, but it is really lovely to have you back on. And I'm very excited about the topic we're going to be discussing. Which, we talked about this a little bit before we were recording. And so we're going to be talking about the issue of environmentalism, which sounds so boring. I know for some reason,
it's
climate
not.
change. It's not, but for some reason, the issue of climate change just like makes people fall asleep, which is sad. And I actually sometimes have the same reaction, which is really bad because this is a very serious problem.
I think we can talk about why that is too. I think there are some good.
Well, what do you think? Okay, well, maybe that's intentional too. Like maybe there's a way that climate change is framed to sort of like make people doze off.
Absolutely.
But I think I want to jump into this one aspect of it though, which is like going to be the theme of what we're going to be discussing, because in the mainstream, like environmentalist movement, climate change movement, actually just in the mainstream media in general, this problem of environmental degradation and climate change, it's attributed to humans behaving badly. It's basically humanity's fault, right? Like that's become the consensus. And it's not entirely wrong, because there is something that some humans are doing, right? That are impacting the climate. But by kind of making this general culprit be humanity, the structural systemic reasons
exactly
that are harming the planet are left out, particularly the economic system driving it, like capitalism. But I like that when we were speaking about this, you actually took it a step further and you make the argument that all of our environmental problems actually come from colonialism.
Yeah.
So let's start there. Can you explain
Yeah.
why you think that is and maybe give some examples?
Yeah, and I think, the whole problem of like people falling asleep when you start talking about climate change, I think that has to do with not because it's boring, but because it's numbing and like
Mhm.
kind of depressing because of the way that it's presented. Like if it's actually just humanity, if it's actually just humanity is inevitably going to destroy the earth, then why do I have to listen to this, right? Like it's not a problem that's solvable. It's not a thing that anybody can do anything about. So like no thanks, right? And so I think that's a big part of what's going on. And yeah, so about so I'm going to kind of go through a lot of what environmentalists talk about. I'm a professor of environmental well, the faculty is called environmental and urban change. It was once called environmental studies. But a lot of the things that environmentalists talk about are not linked explicitly to colonialism, and they should be. So when we talk about environmentalists talk about this age that we're living in, so they talk about ages of several thousand years, right? The Holocene and the Pliocene, and this one they call the Anthropocene, which is to say that the changes on the planet are being driven by human activity. So it's like in the past, it was like volcanoes or volcanic ash or, the tilt of the sun or things going on in the atmosphere. And now we're the ones changing the atmosphere. That's fine. That actually is reasonable. It's important to not think of ourselves as just entirely subject to geological forces, but as a geological society is a geological force in its own right. That's fine.
Right.
But then when you use that to say, okay, now this is all humanity's fault in this super abstract way, which is the way they teach it to kids. Like they teach environmentalism in public school, and my kids come back and they're like, humans are bad, and it's like, come on, kid, it's not
That's the
humans.
takeaway.
I
That's
don't
it's my
want you.
fault, right?
I'm sending you to school to learn that humans are bad. Like, what is this? Um, but
That's horrible. Yeah.
but yeah, so that means again that leads to all kinds of problems. You misdiagnose it, you can't solve it, and also you blame the wrong people. I read this paper by Samir Dosani, he's a friend. And he wrote that he's in South Africa, and he wrote this paper where he basically said, this is what got me thinking along these lines, or I was just starting to think along these lines. And he said it out explicitly that every environmental problem is traceable to colonialism. And he made a distinction between capitalism and colonialism, which I think we can get to as well, where it's like it's not just like the labor capital contradiction. And so one piece of evidence for this is if you look at the timing. So if you look at the timing of many of these environmental crises that we have, I think I showed you a couple of maps. Like there's the map of forest destruction in the US, right? So
There
you
it
have
is.
1620, you have this extensive forest covering the entire, eastern part of the continent of the continental US and the West. And then 1850, you start seeing it being eaten away. But then by 1920, it's just a tiny fraction of what it was. And so
Jesus.
1850 to 1920 is, that's when the most indigenous land was taken from by the settler state, right? That's when the rapid acceleration. So like after the Mexican American War, after the US Civil War is when they really just started expanding everything into everywhere, and that's where you see this destruction of the forest. And the same goes. This point kind of generalizes to other parts of the world. And then if you think about like what that means in terms of the global economy, they have that. You've probably heard that when the British arrived in India, India was like 25% of global GDP, and when when and now it's like 4, right? Like by the time the
Yeah, and I
British
mean,
left.
I just changed the visual on the screen right now, so like I don't know if you
Yeah.
just so for those who are actually
Yeah.
watching, you can see exactly what you're talking about
Yeah.
in terms of the year, and you see a
Yeah.
real big drop off. I believe that looks like the year 1700, 16,
Yeah.
16, 1700s.
Yeah,
Around then,
1757, yeah, is
yeah,
when the Battle of Plassey was won by the British through treachery, and they slowly, not slowly, they rapidly started to colonize India at that time. So that's when so if you look at the red line and the orange line, that's China and India. So around 1820, they're 25%. China goes up and then it goes down for the century of humiliation to almost
right.
nothing, but then it starts really going up. India goes down and maybe it's recovering now, maybe not. But when you look at the blue lines, the US and Western Europe, the period when they start going up is like around 1820, 1870. That's when they start going up to take their 20, 30+% share of world GDP, is also the age of the most environmental destruction, the most accelerating, rapid environmental destruction. Now,
Mhm.
maybe that's coincidence,
Well,
right?
what's crazy, by the way, about these lines, I just want to like state real quick, is the
Yeah,
Western European line
yeah,
is like at 0%
yeah,
for
yeah,
world GDP, and then around 1820, it just suddenly shoots up
yeah.
as China and India and the Middle East go down.
Yeah, so I know that there's again, like there's these conflations of like industrial society, right? Maybe this is the industrial revolution, but if you look at the details, it doesn't really track. It tracks very well with colonialism,
Hmm.
and industrial revolution also follows colonialism because they're taking the so-called primitive accumulation, where all these stolen resources are what you invest to make the industrial revolution. Finally, so we've talked about forests, and we've talked about, but what about extinctions, right? Wildlife extinctions. That's like the most heartbreaking environmental problem that we have, where
Hmm.
all these species are just disappearing from the earth forever. And this is a chart I found from the U.S. I don't know, USGS, I don't know what, Geological Survey, where they try to track that human population, and they're trying to show you that human population is related to extinction, and that's fine. But it's also, both are related to colonialism, which is the point. Like this is an outcome of a lot of things, one of which is some of the dynamics of imperialism and colonialism, which I can get into, which cause human population to go up the way that it has. So you're not looking at a chart of how human population causes extinctions. You're actually looking at a chart of how colonialism causes extinction and population growth.
And also, like, where is that population growth, which I know we're going to get into in a little bit, but please
Hmm.
continue if you had more to
Yeah.
add to that.
So I guess here's the reason why it's all colonialism. Okay, you have hundreds of thousands of years of humans being on the planet, and only 150 or so years of this accelerating environmental crisis. And you have so it's not humanity. You have thousands or maybe tens of thousands, depending on how you measure, of civilization. So like if you don't have um, if you don't have humanity to blame, sometimes they'll try to blame civilization, right?
Hmm.
And civilization meaning, like, if we are not living like, if we're not living like totally animal, like other animals, then this is going to cause environmental degradation, which I don't think is true either. You have a short window of a few hundred years of these accelerating environmental problems, um, and they correlate time-wise with colonialism. Now, capitalism and colonialism are inseparable historically, but um, I would say, the relationship between them is what's causing the problem. You know, so
Just the
it's not,
challenge.
you can't study capitalism as an abstract model and just deduce that all of these things will happen. We'll talk more about that too.
So, I mean, okay, so if colonialism is to blame for the destruction of the environment, which I think you just laid out a fairly good case, at least for a correlation, um, or if not causation, then the solution becomes what? Decolonization. And the reason I raise that, and I know you want to talk about that, is because I think this might be hard for some people to understand,
Yeah.
particularly those who might believe that colonialism is a relic of the past.
Hmm.
Obviously, the ramifications of it are still playing out today, but
Yeah.
the sort of colonialism of like Western European settlers coming to North America, and Canada, and doing what they did across the Americas in general, or
Yeah.
in South Africa, that this is something that happened a long time ago. It's not happening now. So
Yeah.
for those people who have an understanding of colonialism in that sense, that it's something historical,
Yeah.
can you also explain what decolonization would mean in the present
Mhm.
day?
Yeah. So if you think of historical phases, right, you have a phase of colonialism, which I think everybody agrees not everybody. There are some weird books coming out now called like
Oh,
it was not stolen or something. Anyway,
right.
um, but from the 1500s to the 1700s, you have like colonization of the Americas, genocide of the indigenous peoples, enslavement of Africans to work the land that's stolen. And then from the 1700s to 1757, I always date with India, to the 1850s, you have these things happening in Asia, right? Like the forced entry into China, the Opium Wars, the colonization of India. And so that's another phase of colonization, because that's also when slave trade is abolished in 1860. After the Civil War, the 1860s, slavery ends in the US.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's the next phase. And then the real peak of colonialism is like the scramble for Africa, where they basically take every square inch of the planet for colonies. And so the reason people think that it's over is because there really was quite a bit of decolonization in Asia and Africa. India in 1947, and Africa in the 50s and 60s, most of those countries, China in 1949. So a lots of countries did really decolonize, but there are still colonies, like not neo-colonies, but outright colonies: Hawaii, Puerto Rico, the overseas France, Palestine, the Golan Heights of Syria. So there are active colonial projects happening in different parts of the world that still have not been decolonized, right? Then there's also First Nations in Canada, like indigenous territories that are also being colonized in a process of ongoing colonization. I wrote an article last year just looking at all these court cases that Canada, the state, is fighting against indigenous nations. And it's funny because they always lose, because the legal basis for Canada is not very strong. It's based on these treaties that were kind of dishonest in the first place and not being
Right.
followed by Canada in the second. And so it's when they go to court, the Canadian state usually loses to indigenous nations. But they just keep going. They just keep fighting to try to continually encroach on the lands that indigenous people have left. That's colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
But then, as your listeners probably know better than most listeners, because you've had a lot of these great political economists on, like Utsa Patnaik and Prabhat Patnaik, there's also this neocolonialism, which there's lots of mechanisms, but the main mechanism is just the transfer, or the main reality of neocolonialism is the transfer of trillions of dollars of value from the global south to the global
Right.
north every single year. So that is a transfer of labor power, it's a transfer of spending power, but it's also a transfer of ecological value, right? It's also a transfer of renewable resources that are not going to be renewed because of this transfer, non-renewable resources that are never, that are not, can't be renewed because they're not renewable in the first place. The costs of cleaning up the pollution, the costs of species being driven into extinction, the costs of carbon dioxide being emitted into the atmosphere. So like when you think of environmental activists, they'll have this slogan, which I think is solid. It's a reasonable slogan to have, where you say, let's keep the oil in the soil, keep the resources in the ground. But that connects to decolonization because it's being pulled from the ground and sucked straight to the global north. and there's no way to keep it in the ground or some of it in the ground unless you change that relationship.
That's a really good point. And then that's a good segue also into, let's talk about that. Let's talk about, what are, for those environmentalists who are listening, I'm sure they all are. What are, let's imagine that they are. Let's imagine. What are the problems and the limitations of mainstream environmentalism? I mean, something that you referred to, which I thought this was a really interesting term. You referred to it as Anglo-American environmentalism.
Yeah, we can get into why I call it that, but yeah.
And does our good friend Greta Thunberg by any chance fit into this paradigm?
Yeah. So Anglo-American environmentalism, because so as we already said, like, it leads to this blaming of humanity, right? This kind of misanthropic view, which is not going to help you solve the problem. And it leads to the idea that humans need to be removed from nature in order for nature to thrive. And this is also historically wrong, because all of these landscapes that are beloved by environmentalists, whether it's like the Great Plains or the forests of the West Coast or the Amazon, right? The Amazon rainforest. These are all what you could call cultural landscapes. They're all co-creations of indigenous civilization and nature. So you can't, the Amazon, the latest research is that the Amazon has been inhabited for longer than it was the Amazon as we know it. So that tells us that the Amazon evolved with the indigenous populations that live there. So Greta Thunberg, I don't know, I'm all for anytime I see someone yelling at politicians, it's all fine for me. Like,
yeah, I know. I don't like hate her. I mean, she hasn't done anything like that I hate. It's more just like there's some limitations there.
If you play some role in catching Andrew Tate, like, it's all you can't have a problem with that. But like, they have made, like, Greta and I think the Extinction Rebellion and like these various youth movements for climate, they've all been very explicit to say they're not against capitalism. And if you start with that, you're not going to go anywhere much. So that's my problem with Greta Thunberg's movement, is like, you declare that you're against capitalism, which that you're not against capitalism, which means you've declared that you're not going to address the causes of the problem. So,
and then of course there is, and when we talk about Anglo-American environmentalism, there's this very, very dark history of the conservation movement. And I actually did an interview months and months back with Robert Flummerfelt, who exposed some of the hidden agendas and actual like massacres and atrocities that were taking place in a part of the Congo in the name of conservation of wildlife, where like people were being like removed from their land, and in some cases their communities being murdered by US and EU, particularly German funded or trained like forces. But basically, like with the conservation movement, conservation is seen as this like lovely, wonderful thing. Like, we want to conserve nature and conserve wildlife. But its founding fathers actually included racists and eugenicists, very much involved in settler colonialism, people like Teddy Roosevelt and Madison Grant. And they were, of course, driven by this core myth of the settler colonial project being all about this kind of virgin or unpeopled wilderness that Westerners, quote unquote, discovered, right? And then that's, of course, in the past, but you can connect it in many ways to today. Absolutely. Because today the conservation movement, which much of it receives funding from states in the global north and has the backing of a lot of environmentalists, whether we're talking about celebrities or like other activist figures. Today, the conservation movement uses this notion of wildlife protection to continue to displace native peoples, whether it's in the Congo, like the story I just mentioned, or in other parts of the world, as this pretext to clear land for very different, for a variety of uses, but in a lot of cases to prioritize really like keeping it nice and pleasant for white tourists to come look at like nature and animals. Exactly. But, can you talk about the very problematic nature of conservation efforts and its relationship to the actual destruction of nature?
Yeah. So conservation, I mean, conservation in the 19th century is also like it's not about going and looking at beautiful animals and taking beautiful pictures of these animals for your Instagram or whatever.
No
They
way.
wanted to go and shoot them. They wanted to go and shoot these animals. So it's always been like, let's
Are
go
you-
to Africa and shoot the big five, right? Like they want to go and shoot lions, shoot leopards, shoot rhinoceros, shoot buffalo. That's what they want to do. And so that was the understanding, right? Like Ducks Unlimited, conservation authority, organizations today are still about that. They want to preserve lands so hunters can go and shoot them. So it's already this strange thing, and of course they prioritize the shooting over the preservation, right? So ultimately they've preserved many species right up to death. Like this kind of preservation is gonna leads to extinction. Then yes, so there's a transition now to like bird watching and like Costa Rica, everybody goes to look at and you count the number of species that you've seen, and that's cute, that's good, but it's also this like search for a business model that justifies displacing peasants, because it's like if you have a ecological landscape where there are peasants and they're farming and there's a matrix of trees that birds use, and that's like a living landscape that people have kept, and that's why the birds are still there after hundreds of years, right? But to get rid of all that so you can have hotels and conservation areas, then you're bringing in the tourist dollars, and that becomes like the next business model. And there's always, with Latin America, with Africa, there's always like a search for the next business model, and the people who always suffer from this business model is the people who actually live on the land, right? And so that's another way that colonialism continuously attacks and destroys traditional or indigenous or peasant societies. Now, you talked also about the case, I think, of the DRC, and a national park where people are being displaced. I mean, Canada is amazing for this because Canada funds these kinds of projects while displacing indigenous people from land in Alberta for tar sands and like poisoning water and kicking people off their land in BC for because they want to build pipelines. But it's like, yeah, we care about conservation in other countries, right? But of course they don't. And like I wrote an article last year about the Colombian army that's been displacing peasants. It was before Petro's elected. I don't know what Petro's going to do. Hopefully they can change this, but the Colombian army displaces peasants in the name of like ecological conservation. And then what happens is, like, sometime after all the peasants are gone, the state grants some mining concession to some corporation. So conservation is like what gets them in, and then at the end, the use of the land has nothing to do with conservation.
That's really sad, but at the very least, like, I can still go shoot an elephant, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I mean, what's really more important here, Justin? Come on.
You're right.
So,
but if you shoot them out of love, right? Like you're shooting them because
like
you
with,
love them.
like it's like the heart-shaped bullets. Is that a thing? Yeah. If it's not, there's your business model.
There you go.
Heart-shaped bullets. I like that idea. So you've argued that there are two critiques of environmentalism. There's the anti-colonial critique from indigenous societies, and there's the aristocratic critique. And I mean, of course, that does sound somewhat self-explanatory, and there's those two names. But can you break down for us, for those who aren't as smart as I am and just automatically know what those mean?
Yeah.
Can you break down these two critiques and which one is actually on point? No spoiler alerts, but I think I have an idea of which one is.
I am a professor, Rania, so yes, I can do this. I can break this
I
down.
believe in you.
No, but yeah, so there are, like, if you look at the Marxist critique of ideology, right, and the idea that there are ideologies that are organic to certain class interests or classes, like I guess Gramsci talks about like organic ideologies and like organic intellectuals, right? So if you think about like different environmentalisms that way, there's the so-called bourgeois revolution, which is what the Marxists think of it as, like the industrial revolution, where if you think of the industrial revolution as one class replacing another as the ruling class, it's basically like the owners of capital displacing the land holding aristocracy. And they displace them, but it's like you kind of like, it's for the most part, especially in places like England, a pretty comfortable displacement. Like they kind of got assimilated into the ruling class.
Yeah.
One or two of them might lose their heads, but for the most part, they just become part of the industrial ruling class.
Yeah.
But like when that translates, like in terms of that ideology and the way they view industrialism, it becomes like this sad longing for these beautiful pristine landscapes they used to be able to hunt and ride and chase and shoot foxes or have their dogs go and kill foxes. Like this was the way that gentlemen used to live, right? They would go and experience these beautiful landscapes and kill these beautiful animals. And that was and their serfs would be working away to make sure that everything was taken care of, and their slaves in the colonies would be getting them their sugar and their tea and all that stuff that they like to have. And as opposed to industrial society where there's these satanic mills and smoke and pollution and people are working and like everybody gets all this stuff now, like there's this kind of mass consumption which they don't like, and it makes things a lot less heroic, and it's just it leads to bad places, right? It leads to like the kind of exclusion of what we really need is to exclude people. And they say people, but they still want to be able to go themselves and shoot animals or do science, whatever. Like there's an idea that like exclusion will be exclusion of most people, but like some people with the right keys to the kingdom will be able to go and experience this natural beauty, right?
Yeah.
And then the indigenous vision of this is like there are so many societies that had so many really, really good ideas about how to live in a landscape and how to manage resources. And they, we'll talk a little bit about some of them and the specifics a little bit later. But the point here is like when you think of anything good that any environmentalist is doing now, and you look at it carefully, you'll find that they're probably just catching up to what indigenous people already know. And if you find really bad environmentalists that have really bad ideas that are leading to, the displacement of peasants from their land or the destruction of, ultimately it always leads to the handing over of the land to some corporation. Though you'll find those critiques are coming from that romantic aristocratic model. And like think of people like Tolkien or Byron or Alfred Lord Tennyson or whatever, those romantic poets. That's the source for these for what I call like Anglo-American environmentalism.
And I mean, and then there's like, I want to talk about the issue of land theft, which we sort of covered a little bit earlier when we showed that visual of like the forest, and you went through the time periods and how the clearing of forests across the U.S. coincides with the stealing of land from indigenous people. But the level, like the extent of land theft is just so shocking because of how much was stolen from indigenous people across the Americas. And I want to, for those who are watching, there's this really good animated map that I want to show from Vox. I know it's surprising to come from Vox, but here's that map. I think it's really good because it's just like, for those who are watching, it really just shows, it's like like
a monster. It's like a monster eating at all the land and turning it white.
Look at that. Look at that. Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. That is what European settlers and then who became after the United States became the United States, that's what they took from people and killed a lot of them. Like something between 50 to 100 million along the way died, and like cleared and stole their land.
Yeah.
And it's like horrifying to look at. And then you also had this, you also shared with me this map that was made, I believe, at York University, right?
Sure was.
Okay, so that's where you're at. I don't know if you had anything to do with the making of this map.
Sure did.
You did.
Yeah,
All
it
right
was like
then.
my students that worked on this for like over 5 years. Actually, there were like different students. And can you zoom? You kind of have to zoom out, and
Oh
then
yeah, I don't know why it automatically did that.
yeah,
Like,
you
you
have
go
to.
up. Why is it like taking me to the right? It's taking me to
You know what?
America.
We're still perfecting it. You know,
Yeah.
it's just
Well, no,
yeah.
it's
Just zoom
also
in.
probably just me, but I don't know. Like, is there a way? Oh, there we go. This is what I want
Yeah,
to do.
there
I
you
want to show
go.
Canada.
You want to show Canada, and then you got to
Yeah.
drag that timeline across. So if you look at the,
So
if
I can
people are
play it,
looking at,
right?
yeah,
I can
if
play
people
it.
are looking at the timeline, you see like, not much
1730.
happening, right? Like this
No.
is all happening down in the south, but then in the 1800s, it just kind of explodes in these like there are these big numbered treaties where you're
We're
gonna
reaching
just see,
1800. We're reaching 1800. Here we
yeah,
go. Here we go.
and
What's going to
then
happen? What's going to happen?
it's yeah,
There it is. There it is.
here they come. Here come
Here
the
they
Canadians.
come. Yeah, here come the
And
Canadians.
then yeah, once you hit like the 1850, yeah, and then the 1880s is the most incredible. So 1870, that's when Louis Riel's
Ooh, look at that. Look at
resistance, yeah,
that.
and
Yeah.
then the rest of it comes in like a couple of bursts. Yeah.
Jesus.
So it's this incredibly the other thing is like with Canada and I think with the US, like it's incredibly fast, and it accelerates in the late 1800s, for a
Mhm.
bunch of reasons. Now, the relationship between indigenous, like the stealing of this land and the destruction of the environment, and there's so many connections, but I'll just tell the Canada story in a little bit of detail. But you can imagine same thing in California, same thing in occupied Mexico, as it deserves to be called. Same thing on the plains, same thing in the eastern forest, just a little bit earlier. But like Canada, so the French arrive, they set up these posts to trade beaver furs, and again, like, was there huge demand for beaver furs in Europe? No, like they create the demand based on the colonial relationship. Like that's what people need to understand about colonialism. It's not about the specific resource. The resource changes over the course of history, but the relationship doesn't, unless there's a revolution. So the French arrive, and the forts that the French set up are epicenters of smallpox, and other diseases that the Europeans bring, and the disease just kind of radiates out over decades and centuries to where indigenous people, like 90% of the society, will die from these diseases, right? So it's like absolutely catastrophic, apocalyptic. If you want to talk like an environmentalist, it's the apocalypse, right? And then that causes a whole bunch of ecological collapse, because the way that the land is taken care of actually requires people. And this is another piece of like environmentalism that people don't understand, but like there's an eco-agricultural system, even when it's not like agriculture the way that we would understand it as like this giant plantation, but like it's agriculture and ecology and people, and they're all working together. And when there's a collapse of the human population, there's huge changes to the land and the way that the land is evolves, the way that the landscape evolves.
Yeah.
And this gets much worse when the British take over, for a number of reasons. Their genocidal warfare is one of them. They take advantage of all of these demographic losses that the indigenous societies suffer to put their settlers in. They push west, but then they're also, the way that they're doing the beaver pelt trade also basically drives the beavers to extinction. And then when they drive the beavers to extinction, they don't just say, oh, well, we better just leave the country back to the indigenous people, right? Like that's what, if it was about beaver pelts, that's what they would do. But it's not about beaver pelts. So then they move on and they develop this meat industry around the buffalo, which is this inexhaustible resource. There's just fields of buffalo, right? It's an ocean of buffalo in the ground. So they then, more quickly than the beaver, they drive the buffalo to extinction. And towards the end, they're driving the buffalo to extinction on purpose because they want to starve indigenous people into accepting worse terms on the treaties for their land. So that they drive indigenous people onto these small reservations, and and that's where they start stealing their children in larger numbers to take them to these residential schools. Canada, I don't know what it's like in the States, but in Canada, it's a big story over the past few years because they
Right.
keep unearthing these mass graves of indigenous children. So like, first of all, like what kind of school has a grave, right? Like what kind of school has a grave attached? Why do all these schools have graves? And it's like thousands and thousands of children that were, done to death in these residential schools. So the point here is like the way we got to this point is through several things: plagues, pandemics, genocidal warfare, but also the driving of species to extinction, right? And like in Eastern Canada and the Eastern US, they had this agriculture based on, they call them the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash, and they grow together, and they, provide the different nitrates and the different things that they need. Nitrogen fixing is done by the beans, and it's this beautiful system. And the settlers destroyed that on purpose, partly because of like, we go, when we take their land, we go to where they are, we burn their crops, we kill them, we kill their children, all
Make
that
it
stuff.
impossible for them to survive, basically. Yeah.
That's like part of the US way of doing warfare to this
Right.
day, is like they don't just defeat an army on the
Scorch it
battlefield,
all.
they go and attack the means of survival. So, but they also did it like by releasing pigs. So like their pigs would go and root up these crops, and they did that on purpose. And it was like a big grievance of indigenous people, where they would come to some deal to like allow the settlers to settle their land here, and then the settlers would just let their pigs go and destroy all the agricultural fields.
Yeah.
Likewise in Hawaii, there's like a whole agricultural system with taro and fish ponds, and they did just incredible things that settlers see and just destroy, right?
Horrible.
And yeah, so that's the relationship of environmental destruction to these processes is just, it's completely inseparable from the unfolding of colonialism.
It's like so overwhelming.
Yeah.
Because that's just one part of one continent. It's basically one continent.
Yeah.
North America. Like it's just one part of the world.
Yeah.
And that speaks to the issue of like the land theft, which is not, of course, just isolated to North America. We could talk about Australia. We could talk about what's still, ongoing in Israel, Palestine.
Yeah.
But the land theft is just one kind of colonial relationship, which you alluded to earlier. But there are others in Latin America, which I think included a mix. Of course, there was land theft. There was always there's also like a lot of rape and intermixing as a result, and of course genocide as well, and a lot of resource extraction. And then there's Asia. What happened in Asia was different, and it's different in different parts of Asia, as well as Africa, which is different in different parts of Africa. Can you explain the sort of colonialism that took place in those different geographic locations? I mean, obviously it would take like hours to really go through it, but maybe like briefly. And how, and particularly though, how it's impacted the indigenous populations, and what in turn that of course is meant for the environment, because it keeps going back to that.
Yeah. So the slave trade is another big part of like that whole idea that the demographic collapse of a population also causes an ecological collapse. Like there's this, if you're an this is the problem, right? Like Anglo-American environmentalism, especially in its racist versions, is like, oh great, there's a demographic collapse, but it's not great even in environmental terms. It's not good. It's actually really catastrophic. But like when you think of resources, so with Latin America, I always recommend these books, Eduardo Galeano's Open Ways in Latin America, and Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. They go kind of country by country, resource by resource, and they show how these processes unfold. So with Latin America, the main point that I keep coming back to is like the particular resource doesn't matter as much. So like Bolivia, everybody thinks of Bolivia and lithium now, like Elon Musk saying we'll coup who we want, get used to it, whatever. But before lithium, it was coca leaf, and before coca leaf, it was tin, and before tin, it was silver. So, and Venezuela, like the oil country, was a superpower of coffee bean, cacao bean, before oil. So they're always in this position of supplying raw materials, and they're not allowed to develop industries or any kind of independent economic base.
Yeah.
And that was where, like, this is where history, like recent history, comes in for all these countries, because they, in the 70s, which was also like Earth Day and like all these different environmental small is beautiful soft energy paths.
Did we want to take shorter showers yet, or was that not until
Yeah,
okay.
no, well, yeah, in the 70s there was an idea, which is, I think, is like, there's a lot of reasonable stuff in environmentalism. So their idea was like, you don't need energy, you want hot showers and you want cold beer, and like getting those things without necessarily using a lot of electricity is a goal. There's things that make sense, but you can't do any of them. You can't do any of them under colonialism, and that's the issue. So, but in the 70s, it wasn't just OPEC. It wasn't just the petroleum producers that formed a cartel. They were trying to form cartels for everything, for copper and for other resources, to get a better deal so that they could invest in all of these things, including mitigating the damage from extraction, as well as higher standards of living, making sure that they could renew their resources. And that was like, if you look at the 70s, through the lens of like Michael Parenti or Chomsky or Bill Bloom, it's like, these are all like, it's a coup a week, right? They're overthrowing all these governments. Every time a government tries to do something, they're overthrowing them. They're instigating civil wars. And that was the price of trying to achieve a more just order in terms of resources and in terms of changing the neo-colonial relationship on ecological terms and resource
How
terms.
dare they?
Yeah, and they stand for it, right?
And then there's like we could do like a whole other, I would imagine actually, like, has somebody written a PhD on the way like IMF and World Bank structural adjustment programs destroyed environments? I mean,
Yeah, probably. I could probably find something in our archives.
well, then we have this issue though of Malthusianism, right?
Yeah.
And you can explain to those who don't know or who've
Yeah.
heard the term but maybe don't know what it means, what exactly it means. But I'm just curious, like, where does that, I don't know if I want to call it a philosophy or like a view of the world. Where does that fit into all of what we're talking about? And then there are some climate, the reason I raise it is because not all, but there are certain segments
Absolutely.
of the sort of climate change doomsday like environmentalist types who might even to some degree, there are some people who admit that capitalism is problematic here.
Mm-hmm.
But then their response to it is something that I think is really dangerous. Because there are really powerful people who view the world in these terms. So yeah, I guess, what's Malthusianism, and why is it bad, and where does it fit into the whole like environmentalist structure?
It's so bad. So yeah, we've talked about Anglo-American imperialism, environmentalism. Oops.
Is there any other kind of imperialism these days? I don't know.
No. Yeah, that, not, on this show, that's probably less controversial, but no.
Yeah, there'll be people talking about like Iranian imperialism and certain. I don't think those people watch this show. But if you do, welcome. Please stay and listen.
Hi, hit that like button.
Smash it. Don't hit it. Smash that like button and let me explain to you why you're wrong. But anyway.
So Malthus. Okay, so but that lineage of Anglo-American environmentalism goes back as far as this. It goes back to Malthus. So you have your Malthus, you have your Madison Grant, you have your Teddy Roosevelts. And Malthus is an English reverend or something, right? And the thing people don't understand about how dumb it is to be a Malthusian today is because Malthus didn't even really care about what he was saying. He was basically some kind of paid lobbyist for the landlords. And so he was in a debate with another paid lobbyist for the banks, and they were in a debate about the corn law. So there was this corn law being proposed, which was basically going to say England will import food from Portuguese colonies, and it would be cheaper than food produced in England, which would damage the landlord lobby, because the landlord lobby wants high food prices for what's produced on their land. And the industrial lobby, or the banks, they were figuring we would make more money from industry if we can pay workers less. If the workers' food is cheaper, we can pay them less and we can make higher profits. So it's a debate over which class is going to get more money, and over a specific law that was being proposed in the early 19th century. And Malthus was like, oh, okay, well, so Ricardo has this theory of comparative advantage, which is like, if we produce what we're good at and they produce what they're good at, then everybody benefits. And which basically is an argument against having a diverse sovereign economic base, because they're imperialists. They don't need one, right? They can just take what they want from everywhere in the world. And then Malthus is saying, okay, listen, hear me out. It's not a good idea to give workers cheap food, because it's not even in the interest of workers, because they're just going to eat more. They're going to have more babies. And by having more babies, they're just going to eat away all of the gains that they get from this extra food. So nobody's going to benefit. All you're going to do is get more useless babies being
sounds
born.
like a jerk.
Yeah. So not a fan, right? But it's also like, so now to take an argument that some lobbyist made about a corn law, and like he built this abstract little model about how people would just eat away these gains, and turn that into the basis of your environmental philosophy 200 years later, it's bad enough that he did it, but it's really unforgivable to be doing that now, especially since what we know scientifically about population growth and the circumstances in which populations grow, and it doesn't have anything to do with food at all, really. You can have population growth in a context of food insecurity, and
look at the global south.
It's like, and you can have, exactly. So it's really preposterous. But what Malthusians today are about is using the environmental argument to basically argue for population control, to argue for why we shouldn't stress about epidemics or mass death in the global south, right? So it's just a perverse ideology, and it needs to be discarded by every right thinking person.
It's also kind of like an outgrowth, or maybe a logical sort of conclusion that you might reach if you do go down the sort of rabbit hole of humans are responsible for climate change, and therefore the more humans there are in the world, the more we're going to destroy the environment, as if that's the only way humans can exist. And nature is to destroy it.
So everything that you have to ignore, right? Every indigenous society that you have to ignore to believe that.
Exactly.
You have to,
And we're gonna, I think, get into like one of the things too, that when we talk about, we're going to talk about anti-communism. And I think that like plays a role. And also it's like, not even just that indigenous societies have existed prior to all of this, like in harmony with nature, but that there are other societies who've actually managed to implement certain structures economically. And we've seen changes in the way that the environment exists in those places. And we can get to that. But, first, I think we have to kind of touch a few things, or explain a couple things for those who, to get people to understand that point. And that's, there are some in the progressive environmentalist movement, which I mentioned earlier, who are at least like willing to acknowledge that role of capitalism in destroying the planet. In fact, I think more and more, maybe not in the very mainstream, like you mentioned, maybe not in the very mainstream environmentalist movement that you'll see like given airtime on CNN or something. You won't see that sort of acknowledgement, but I see it more and more among certain people that I'm surprised to see it from, of really acknowledging capitalism is really a problem. It's destroying the planet. So let's start there. Where does capitalism fit into climate change? And how do you place it in your argument that the ultimate foundation of all of this destruction is colonialism?
Yes. So I always look at these things historically, which is why I can't ever separate capitalism from colonialism, because they're evolving at the same time, and the dynamics are inseparable. But
Hmm.
economists, including some of our best friends, like to make models. They like to make kind of abstract models of how the economy works, and they say, the economy works like this. A capitalist economy works like this, and that's actually pretty useful. So if you think of a formal model of what capitalism is, as opposed to feudalism or socialism, what does capitalism have? Capitalism has markets. So
Hmm.
goods are distributed through markets. Land is distributed through markets. Labor is distributed through markets. Buyers, sellers competing. The buyers try to get the lowest price. The seller tries to get the highest price through this interaction with competitors. You converge on a price, an equilibrium price, right? So that's the
Hmm.
model. You have private ownership of the means of production. So individual or corporate owners own the factories, they own the land, and they try to produce and they try to make a profit, which means they try to conflict with workers. They try to pay the workers. It's a labor market. They try to pay the workers the least. The workers try to get the most. There's a conflict over that. So there's other elements, but like private ownership, profit, markets for allocation, that's the kind of abstract model for capitalism.
Hmm.
That leads, within that model, if you understand that, you're guaranteed environmental destruction. So why is that? One, if you can't plan, right? Markets are the ones that allocate everything. They allocate water, they allocate energy, they allocate rhinoceros horn, they allocate burger, whatever, like meat. They allocate things that are intrinsically coming from nature. They're coming from the environment, and you cannot use human intelligence to make a plan for how you're going to use these things. It's the market that does this. So that means guaranteed things are going to be driven to extinction, just because you cannot have a conscious plan under capitalism. You have to, if you even have regulation, the pro-capitalist lobby is going to say that's interfering with the market, right?
Yeah.
If you have private ownership and competitive markets, you have an imperative for growth. If your corporation isn't growing, your competitors are growing, and they're going to put you out of business. If you have to grow and grow, you have to consume more and more resources, you have to produce more and more. That's also going to lead to environmental destruction, because again, you can't have a sensible thing where it's like, hey, let's look at what we need, let's look at some of what we want, let's balance this with other things that we want in the environment, and let's make a plan for production. You can't do that in capitalism. You have to produce under pressure. Now, that's growth. Growth is bad. But guess what? Austerity is also bad. So in capitalism, you have to preserve your profits when there's a downturn in the business cycle. You do that by squeezing workers. You do that by reducing their wages. You get rid of their social wage. You get rid of their public protections, and also that means, like, think about all the things that if workers could get for free, whether it's transit or healthcare or education. Okay, also water and a right to food and a right to enjoy yourself outside in a public park or in a forest. Well, you have to take all of those things away as well. And
Hmm.
that's how you make people desperate. That's how you drive their wages down. So that means austerity is also bad for the environment. It takes away the resources that you need to protect the environment. Then, oh, did you want to?
No,
I'm
no,
just
it's just
gonna
like
keep going.
no, it's just like capitalism
I
is
got
so
more.
horrible. No, it's so horrible. I'm just like, man, that's a great point. I mean,
I
I
got
know
I
all
got
this, but
I got at least
no,
three more.
keep it
So
going, man. No, keep it going. Keep it going.
when you have wealthy people, they are trying to accumulate relative to others, right? So like in capitalism, you also signal that you're wealthy, and you signal your status through the goods that you accumulate. It's not your bloodline anymore, unless it is, because we have monarchy and everybody follows these people in England or wherever they are.
But like, I
Um,
mean, also, we do have like shows like Succession that show that we have like a similar sort of,
yes,
companies being handed down to the children of the The
Right.
fail sons and the fail daughters of the CEOs who founded the companies. But continue.
Yes. But like you have to have, if you have the right car that nobody else can afford, or you drink this specific whiskey that nobody else can afford, that actually shows your status, right? So you can never, you could imagine a situation where everybody could have nice things, but you can't imagine a situation where everybody can have nice things that are better than everyone else. That's something only a few people can have, and
Right.
that struggle to try to get those again leads to environmental destruction. Then there's this mechanism which was identified in I think in the 1800s, which is it blew my mind. This was one of these things as an environmentalist that you study that you're just like, oh no. So you take a forest, right? And you take a forest and it's growing at say 5% a year. You own the forest because it's private ownership. So I own this forest. I cut down, I could get 5% growth a year of trees. I cut down the trees, I sell them for logs, I sell them for lumber, and I get 5% return on my investment, which is awesome. Life is good. The trouble is, nothing that I'm doing changes. There's no fire, there's no catastrophe, there's no disease, there's no spruce budworm eating my forest. Nothing happens in nature. But out there in the bank, the interest rate goes from 5% to 6%. Now, as an owner of this forest, trying to maximize my returns, the logical thing for me to do is to cut down the entire forest, sell all that stock, and invest it in the bank. Because I was only making 5% on this forest, and I could make 6% in the bank. So there's this turning real nature, real capital, real things into money, which happens under finance capital arrangements that leads to rapid destruction of renewable resources. The minute that you can make profits elsewhere and money can move so much more easily, right? A forest can't move, but money can move. So you cut down the forest and you move the money.
Whew.
So that's a destructive mechanism. And then, you can think of like economics as a cause of environmental destruction. Economics as like the academic field of economics, because it totally distorts the way that people think about the environment. It makes the environment external. So resources are free, pollution is free to deal with. And then they do, like, economists do all kinds of bizarre stuff, right? Yeah.
I mean,
It's bad out there.
well, there's the whole Chicago School of Economics,
Yeah.
which, has done a lot of damage around the world. But yeah.
There's this thing called the valuation of nature, where they try to put a dollar value on ecosystem services. And the first time I heard of it, I was totally horrified, and I've only been more horrified the more I hear about it, because all you do when you put a dollar value on nature is you make it tradable. You basically are saying there's something out there that's worth more. So I've seen evaluations of all of the terrestrial ecosystems on Earth, meaning like all the rainforests, all the grasslands. So all the systems that produce all the food and oxygen and water that you use.
Yeah.
And they valued it a few years ago at $72 trillion.
Okay.
I'm like, that's cool, right?
All right. That's
That's
a
a lot of money.
Yeah, it's a lot of money.
And then I found another valuation of like all the real estate in the world as 200 trillion. And then I was like, oh, this is awesome. Just sell some of that real estate, and then you can buy an Earth.
Oh my god.
So
my
like,
god.
it just tells you the absurdity of these kinds of things. And it actually, it's absurd when you're talking about this level, but it's also absurd at the micro level. Like it's more absurd at the macro level, but it's equally absurd to put dollar values on ecosystem services. You can't do without them. Why are you putting a dollar value on something you can't do without?
I mean, it's like at this point, it's really surprising that we don't have like a part of the stock market that's all about, putting or speculating on planets or something.
Yeah.
Like,
maybe we'll have another planet out there one day.
Yeah. Well, like it's the whole like, rocket ship to Mars thing that you do have like, wild, crazy billionaires, trying to actually make happen. But I could foresee some sort of future where like yeah, I'm gonna start buying real estate on the moon, and then from the moon, I'm gonna go to here, and then like maybe something in
Yeah.
some other universe, and then it starts like a whole system of speculating that like crashes the economy because there's like derivatives
Yeah, a
associated.
bubble. This
There's
the,
securities and derivatives, and I don't understand half the words I'm saying, but
the multi-planet
um,
bubble.
I want to put the same question to you though that I just put about capitalism,
Hmm.
in terms of its destructiveness on the environment. And can you give an explanation about the ways that imperialism destroys the environment? And when I think of imperialism, I think of actually, Ben Norton described it this way, and I really think it's like
Mm.
it's a very easy way to understand imperialism very quickly, and like for anybody who's like thinks of imperialism as something too abstract, is that it's just the way that capitalism is organized around the world.
Yeah, that's great.
But yeah, how does imperialism impact the environment? I'm guessing not in a good way.
Not in a good way.
Guess it,
No,
yeah.
not in a good way.
Safe
Um,
bet.
so, yeah, I like that. I like Ben's formulation. I was just listening to an old Michael Parenti speech, and he said, imperialism is when what you're doing, what empires do to like to make their empire on an ongoing basis. Like empire is the noun, and imperialism is like the verb almost, right? Or
Yeah,
the
that
people
makes
who do
sense.
it. Imperialists are the people who do it, and so in a way everything that we've talked about is imperialism, and if you want to focus on one part of it, which is like the ongoing maintenance of the military and political architecture that keeps those trillions of neocolonial drain flowing from south to north, right?
Mhm.
So in order to do that, you have to have your IMF, and you have to have your World Bank, and you have to have these imperialist financial arrangements, but you also have to have a military kind of monopoly, which is fading now. But the military monopoly has always, or not always, but like since industrial warfare for the past 150 years that we've been talking about, it requires petroleum and aluminum and steel and other specific resources that are mined. So like mining and extractive industry, it's not optional for imperialists, right? You can't have a military industrial complex without these resources. So the fact that the things that the US does so desperately to make sure they have privileged access to these resources, and also control so they can deny them to others, and then the things that people who are trying to survive or resist are doing, or countries are doing, to get those, that creates a competition for resources that are mined, and mining is one of the most destructive activities that happens. Same with when they're used, all the explosions, all the nuclear tests, all the bullets that are fired into all these areas, everything that they do is super destructive, and then the bases are destructive. The US military is the biggest polluter, like the single biggest polluter on the planet.
Yeah.
Then there's all the food fights, right? Like we talked about how the US attacks indigenous societies by attacking their agricultural basis, like their land base and their food base. But like sanctions, World Bank displacement of peasants, all of those things are also to undermine the food security of global South countries. And that destruction of peasant agriculture that's implied by destroying food security and food sovereignty is hugely environmentally destructive. So the need to maintain that control through the food weapon is it's a source of famine, it's a source of hunger, it's a source of population manipulation, demographic manipulation, and it's also environmentally destructive. Now, population, let's talk about population a little bit. There are a few things that are known about how populations on a cumulative level, and why they stabilize. And like people think now that the human population is going to stabilize not very long from now, like around 2050, and it's going to stabilize around 10 billion. So the rate of population growth around the world everywhere is slowing. The population is not growing that fast anymore. And the main thing we know, it's a pretty robust scientific finding, is that the main reason populations stabilize is when women have the empowerment to decide how many children they want.
Right.
And when they are empowered in that way with jobs and incomes and literacy and basically that level of control over their lives, they choose to have around 2 or 3 children.
You mean 10
I'm sorry,
isn't
did
the
you say 10?
ideal? I don't know, man. I mean, okay, 2 to 3, fine. I
If
always
you say
thought.
so. So yeah, that seems to be, like wherever you look, in countries where they have this over time, that's what you end up having. And so that's what's ultimately going to stabilize the world population. But if you're a leader of a country like Uganda, where you want a big army for various reasons, you actually they'll actually flout the known science about what stabilizes population because they want to have a big army. And so population is a big correlate of power, your ability to stand, like who can stand against the US now, like China, Russia
Mhm.
has a smaller population than the US, but like
Still pretty big though.
it's 180 plus million, and the US can't get 180 million over there. So
Mhm.
it's a big enough population, but like countries that don't have that don't have any, don't have much chance of
This doesn't bode well for Lebanon. We think we've got like 6 million people, and like 2
yeah.
million of them aren't even Lebanese citizens. So like, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. And I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
on that side, but like, settler colonies also lament this, right? Like Israel is constantly lamenting the fact that they can't seem to win the demographic war, like, you know, with the people there trying to
Mhm.
colonize. So, so that because of this military competition, population becomes something that isn't going to just stabilize naturally, but it becomes another variable to manipulate in the struggle either for or against imperialism and colonialism. And then we mentioned how the U.S. Attacks the environment directly, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just the U.S. I give honorable mention to the French when they were colonizing
Yeah,
Algeria. They
why I was gonna say, I was a little concerned that you were gonna leave
leave the
out.
French,
Yeah,
the poor French out.
they get really upset about that. Like, they
Yeah.
actually, like, really, because 'cause they're not, like, an empire anymore, and they get really, I've noticed there's a bit of a, they get real sassy.
Yeah. So French, they attack. I've been like meaning to write an article just about like the attacks against fruit trees, the hatred imperialists have for fruit trees, because and it's like it goes back, like I think Carlyle, Thomas Carlyle, who was like an arch racist imperialist, British imperialist. He wrote an article where he was like, the problem is we can't get these Jamaican like slaves or former slaves to work because they can just go into the field and eat
Yeah.
pumpkin and like grow things in their gardens. Like this has to be stopped, right? So they
Oh.
hate fruit trees because like they just imperialists hate the idea that you could just go and pick something and eat it, right? That's like the most repulsive idea for them. And so they attack fruit trees. The British, like,
How? I didn't know that was, like, I had
it's a
no
thing.
idea that was a thing.
The French did it. The British in Afghanistan, both times they invaded Afghanistan, they did this. They developed a special procedure for killing a fruit tree without cutting it down, where they would basically cut the bark off of it. And they're like, this is great because it kills the tree. It means they can't eat the fruit. They get really depressed because they really like the fruit, and it's great. Like
And
it's a
they
way of
die
showing them.
because they don't have food, or, like,
Yeah,
then they have to, like, go give us their labor so that they
yeah,
can purchase.
yeah.
That's wild. I actually did not
There's a
know that
war on
that
fruit.
was, yeah.
Imperialists hate fruit.
Hey,
Um,
yeah, that should be, like, someone should write that book. The imperialist hate for food.
the
That's so wild,
it's a
though.
pun, right? It's like the
Yeah.
fruits of imperialism or something.
Jesus
Yeah,
Christ.
it's great.
Uh, but I know that the other thing I just wanted to note is, like, you did mention, obviously, like, the raw sort of, like, destruction of actual US attacks on other countries, obviously, like the environmental destruction of like bombing campaigns that include all kinds of toxic substances, in some cases like depleted uranium that leave all these birth defects like we saw in Iraq. What's been done to the landscape of places in Iraq and Afghanistan, I mean, that's going to keep, the cancer rates in places like that end up so much higher for years to come. And then there's also, I feel like it's fair to shout out friend of Breakthrough News, Abby Martin of Empire Files, is working on this documentary, Earth's Greatest Enemy, which is all about like how the US military is the greatest polluter in the world, not just in terms of like the destruction of US military weaponry, but actually the upkeeping of US military weaponry, all these aircraft carriers, and the amount that releases into the atmosphere in terms of like greenhouse gases, as well as she spends a lot of time in Hawaii. And of course, like that Hawaii is like a mix of the colonialism and imperialism, because obviously, like, as you know very well, the US basically colonized Hawaii, took it over. And then actually
pretty recently too, right? Like it wasn't the 1700s. It was like the mid 1800s.
Right.
That they overthrew the queen. It was like a regime change. They kidnapped the queen and overthrew her. Yeah. It was...
And she talks about, I've like talked to Abby about it before, and she'll talk about how like Hawaii is so beautiful, and when you land, there's like all these sort of PSAs like, don't wear this kind of sunscreen because it's like bad for the water if you're gonna get in the water. But then you have Pearl Harbor, which like, of course, the whole point, right? Hawaii's so far from the US. Like it doesn't, there's no logic to why this should be a part of the US. I mean, not that it's okay that the US took everything else that's a part of the US, but I'm just saying like Hawaii is like in the Pacific, so far away, right? But it was literally taken over so it could be like a US military base through Pearl Harbor to project American empire across Asia.
I saw this lecture by a guy who wrote a book. I think the book is called like How to Hide an Empire. And it's got a cool picture of like the continental US, but like he's stuck all these like Puerto Rico and Hawaii and all these countries that the US is currently occupying onto the sides of it. So it looks like this is what the US really is. And he said that like Franklin Roosevelt, right? Like that when he was writing that speech, the day that'll live in infamy or whatever. After the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, he initially said, they attacked, because they didn't just attack Pearl Harbor, they attacked the Philippines and some of the other places. And he included all of them in his speech, and he kept crossing them out. Like there's like drafts of his speech where he kind of crossed those out because he knew that Americans would be like, wait a minute, why do we own the Philippines? Like why do we own the
What's like not anywhere near?
I don't understand.
This is why Americans are like intentionally deprived of geography growing up. I don't know if it's the same in Canada, but as somebody who's American who grew up in the United States, I can attest to this. There's no geography class. There's no real geography taught. Like you maybe learn once in like the 3rd or 4th grade, like how to fill out, the United States map with the states, but you learn nothing about the rest of the world. There's like, I know Canada's up there. I think Mexico's down there and everything else is just around. Right. Like, and that's it. And I think that's on purpose so that you don't ask the question, like, wait, why the Philip? Like, what? Why are we in Iraq? What? Like,
so he took that out. He took that out of the speech.
Right. I just have obviously, gosh, there's like so much more I want to ask you, but then I always have to keep in mind that people are only going to watch such a certain amount of length because we live in a universe of TikTok. So I'm going to keep it to just a couple more questions for you, but I really want you to answer this one in particular, because I think it's such a good point that doesn't get enough attention. You've raised this unique argument about the fact that that there was this role that anti-communism has played in destroying the environment. Can you touch on that?
So the point there is like we've been talking about the indigenous societies that were attacked by the Anglo-American Empire, and it's important. Like we think of communism and we think of Marx, rightly, like Marx and Engels and communist states like the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, but like before there was almost you can think of anti-communism as preceding that kind of communism, because they imperialists understood indigenous societies as communist. Like they called it like primitive communism, because it was societies that, were based on things like taking care of each other and giving people what they needed, right? And so imperialism is anti-communist in a way that, like, communism as we understand it evolved to combat that. So it's a more dialectical relationship,
Yeah.
that than people realize. And in anti-communism, some of the solutions that anti-communists came up with to try to fight communism, like, communists are about giving everybody what they need, through redistribution if necessary. So anti-communists are like, no, you don't need redistribution. We can
Mm.
grow and grow and grow. So, like, the growth imperative is partly an anti-communist imperative. It's a imperative designed to fight communist redistribution. And then also things like anti-communism is also like building the idea that competition is in our species, right? Like, communism is like the idea that we're put here to take care of one another, and capitalism and like anti-communism is the idea that we're here to fight each other tooth and nail. So these are all specific, like, ideologies and practices that come from anti-communism, and anti-communism going back to before communism as we understand communism.
That's so interesting. Like, I feel like we could just talk for like a whole episode about just that. A lot of these questions we could talk for a whole episode about, but I wanted to also ask you about this, which I think, is a fair thing to be concerned about. There have been some signs that climate change could be used as a pretext to justify imperialist aggression or like intervention.
Yeah.
Do you think that there might be some sort of danger that the US could, in fact, start to use it in that way? Like, one example that comes to mind for me when I think about this is I remember a few years back when there was this attack on the Bolivian government.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was when Donald Trump was president, but it was under the guise of opposing the destruction of the Amazon.
Yeah.
And there was even at one point an attempt at like SOS Bolivia or whatever with this in mind. And then there's also the way that, you have these Western funded NGOs in the global South that are on the surface, like all about tackling climate change, which seems like a very good cause. But it reminds me of how there's also Western funded NGOs that are all about, tackling human rights abuses that we've seen being used by the US and the EU and the governments who fund them to help oust governments that the US doesn't like. So, what do you, what's your, I guess, take on that?
I think it's a perfect analogy. And I actually think organizationally, I've never looked into it, but I know Amnesty International and Greenpeace have some kind of relationship, because whenever I'm on the street and there's a fundraiser, it's like they have like their two binders together. I don't know whether they've made like a tactical alliance, but I think it's actually something deeper. They're very analogous because, who's against human rights, right? Like, how could you be against human rights? But it's like, how could you be against, the earth? Nobody's against the earth. But when you think about like what they're doing with that, and because human rights are so uncontroversial, you can apply them everywhere. And where you will in fact apply them will be on against enemies of the US, right? So you can make a human rights case and you can make an environmental case against any country. You can make an environmental case against any country. Anybody, any country at any time is doing something bad for the environment. So that means that if you're the empire and you have all the media and you control everything except like a few YouTube shows like Breakthrough News, you can just spam, the airwaves with like the idea that Bolivia is burning the Amazon. Meanwhile, Bolsonaro's Brazil is actually destroying the Amazon at that time, but nobody cares because that's not the target right now, right? So it's absolutely true. I do think it's bad, but I also think that if people understood what we're trying to say today about like where environmental problems come from and what they actually constitute and how to solve them, that wouldn't be. It's that general like humanity is bad and these are all bad things. Don't use that sunscreen while ignoring the military base and the tar sands mine. That is what leads to this easy way to do this.
And then the question I want to end on, there's actually other things I wanted to talk to you about just because it's like fun to shoot the shit, but we're just going to have to like shelve it for another episode. And it also gives me an excuse to have you back on
Oh yeah,
soon
I'll just
because
come back.
yeah, it's always so fun to talk to you. But you know, I want to sort of end. I think it's a good place to end because
Yeah.
it ends on solutions. And
Yeah.
it's talking about the solution you mentioned in the context of decolonization, you know, as we enter this multipolar era, where countries like China and Russia are asserting themselves and really posing a
Mhm.
challenge to US empire, particularly with respect to China. How
Yeah.
might this new world order, if you will, be beneficial towards this goal of tackling climate change?
Yeah. I mean, we're so propagandized that it's like when I say this, I know people are just like LOLing as they hear it, but I have to say it anyway. Like China is taking climate change way more seriously than the US is. China is, and China can because China can plan. And China has to plan for all of these people that they want to, they have an understanding that they've been a civilization for 4,000 years and they want to be a civilization for 4,000 more,
Right.
right? And like they don't want, like, the Anglo-American view of the world is like grab and destroy and poison everything while you can. There's even a religious element which yet we haven't talked about, which is like the apocalypse is coming, right? The
Oh,
end times are
right.
coming. And it's
Yeah.
like the idea that the end times are coming has been part of colonialism since Christopher Columbus believed the end times were coming. Hernan Cortez believed that the end times were coming, and it led them to do some pretty horrific things. And environmentalists who believe that the environmental apocalypse is coming are not thinking clearly, and they're not trustworthy to solve the problems that we face. And so China has a very serious climate change plan. China has very serious technological plans that they're making to transform their technological base long term into something that works. China also has, people should look this up, the biggest tree planting project in human history by a big margin. Like they're planting trees in this desert. They originally intent was just erosion prevention, but it's like I can't even tell you the number of trees, but it's the biggest tree planting project. If you think of
Are
tree
you
planting,
telling me it's bigger than the whole like Zionist project to like
make the
purchase?
desert bloom.
Yeah, to make the desert bloom. No, no, what is it? Like I remember like to like basically like gift a tree, like the Jewish National Fund, you can like gift a tree to like your nephew or niece or
I
something if
haven't
they're having a bar
I
mitzvah.
haven't done a tree for tree comparison, but I do think that the area
Yeah.
forested is probably bigger
Yeah.
than the
I could
entire
just I sorry, in
area.
my mind, I could just imagine some Israeli politician being like, "Wait a second, we're making the desert bloom." But no,
And
that is actually I didn't
they do watch your show. I know
they
they
do.
do.
I'm sure they do. I'm sure they monitor my show. Hi guys. I hope they watch my I hope that'd be great. I hope they're watching my show.
Maybe they'll
But
learn something.
that's a really good point. I actually did not know that China had embarked on this like massive tree planting
The
campaign that's the biggest in the world.
The
But
idea of just clearing that forest for the financial return, that comes from something called the German normal forest. So German forestry was all about this, like the forest is an industrial forest. It's like a factory for trees.
sounds like a very Nazi kind of
Right. Well, yeah,
attitude
and
towards
Nazi environmentalists, right? Like
Okay.
there's a
Yeah.
connection there, which I think people need to look into and understand. Like that romantic environmentalism is really easy to connect to Nazism, right? And
Yikes.
the Soviet Union, and before the Soviet Union existed, like the Russian, 1905 on, they had this whole debate that continued into the Soviet era that we shouldn't just import the German model. The Russian forest is something special, and we shouldn't just treat it like a plantation or a factory. We should understand it as nature. We should understand the peasants that need it, the peasants that use it. And so they had this whole debate in the Soviet Union that was way more sophisticated, again, than the Western discussion of forestry. And the last example that we have to talk about when we talk about communism and the environment is the Cubans.
Yes.
The Cubans who, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and we mentioned this in the last episode of your show, thanks to the, brilliant playing of this situation by Gorbachev and Yeltsin,
Right.
Cuba was left on their own. They didn't have petroleum. They didn't have any of the things. The Russians abandoned them because they thought that would stand them in better stead with the U.S. Of course, it didn't, and now we have what's
Bad
going
call,
on.
guys. Very
Yeah,
bad
bad
call.
call, right?
Yeah.
Abandoning all your allies. They abandoned Afghanistan. They abandoned Cuba, and it didn't. Look at what happened. But Afghanistan couldn't hold on, but Cuba held on, and Cuba invented basically agroecology. They created this agricultural model that's more productive than big plantations. Takes care of the ecological. That get the land actually improves year after year. The yields are good. The nutrition is good. They created this, and they couldn't have done it again without communism. And some of these examples are in this book by a guy, an academic named Salvatore Engel Dumoro. And the intro to the book is cool because he's like, "Look, I was an anarchist, and I didn't believe."
Oh, I
didn't
like
believe-
was
Yeah,
prior to the anarchist
he's
one
like,
a
I
little bit.
believe. He's like, I believed that authoritarianism was everywhere. But then the more I looked at these communist states and their environmental programs, the more I thought, like, these are actually pretty good.
And you
So
need
the
like a
poor guy,
centralized, powerful
yeah,
state.
the
Yeah.
poor guy just like had to accept that some of these things that these communists were doing were good, and that I think a lot of people would have to come to that conclusion, environmentalists included, if they looked at it.
Yeah, obviously. And then, I think that in the end, what this all means is that, contrary to what US State Department and Pentagon white papers tell us, perhaps a multipolar world
Mhm.
with a country like China being able to sort of challenge that US hegemony could
Yeah.
actually be good for the planet.
Yeah, I think
Perhaps.
so. And I mean, like going back to the 70s where they were trying to get a better deal for their resources, they are getting a better deal for their resources. These deals with China. This is another thing I know you've talked about on this show a lot, like the nature of these deals that the China's making with African countries, Latin American countries. They're more favorable terms than the West. When the West comes and imposes the deal, like the Chinese they want to make a real deal with mutual benefit, and that also is potentially very positive for environmental regulations too.
And there you have it, folks. That's why Justin believes the future is Cuba and China.
Yeah, well.
That's what I'm going to call the episode. The future is Cuba and China with Justin Podur.
by Justin.
That'll be really good for the academic career. I'm sure that'll make its way
Yeah.
around the university.
Oh, thanks, Rania. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Great.
I'm glad I could help. But on that note, Justin, can you tell people how they can follow you, where they can find your work? You host an excellent podcast. Talk about that.
Shucks. Yeah, so we are going at the slowest pace possible through like the Western civilization history curriculum with my old history professor, I mean old history teacher. So we started in 1492, and we are now beginning to approach World War One. So we've gone through this.
That's a lot of time, actually, that you've gone through, and a lot happened between those two years.
And we've been at it for about 3 years, so you have 3 years worth of listening. So it's called the Anti-Empire Project. If you look up the Anti-Empire Project, that's the podcast, and I write the occasional article. That's where you can find.
And you're
me.
on the Twitter.
I'm on the Twitter until we all get kicked off Twitter. Yeah, I'm amazed. I thought I would be gone by now, but.
Well, you know what we didn't do, which we should have, is we should have devoted at least 30 minutes of this episode to the many benefits of Elon Musk for the environment.
Yeah, like he's going to space, he's building underground tunnels.
He'll happily and publicly overthrow your government for lithium.
He single-handedly made electric cars. He built them, he designed them, everything. Yeah.
And also he's got this like weird I guess it's almost like a eugenicist sort of mentality where
Yeah.
it's like he thinks that he has to spread his seed and have like as many children as possible because he's he's as successful as he is because of his genetics, his
Yeah, no,
superior genetics.
this
Yeah,
is Malthusianism and neo-Darwinism, and there's a lot of that in that, in that crowd, right?
great guy. Great guy. On that, but thank you. I thank you so much, Justin, for spending an hour and a half with me discussing all this stuff. We definitely have to do this again, very, very soon. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thanks for watching, everyone. If you want to see more progressive anti-imperialist content like this, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can stay up to date with the latest breakthrough news content. And if you want to support our work and get access to exclusive content, head over to patreon.com/breakthrough news.